there is a war at the root of every story this channel has ever told you. A war so old and so vast that the gods themselves rarely spoke of it directly, as though even they preferred not to remember how narrowly the whole shape of the world had once hung in the balance. You have heard its opening and its closing before. In brief, in the very first tale we ever told here, the swallowed children, the stone in the swaddling clothes, the boy raised in secret on a hidden mountain. But you have not yet heard the war itself, the 10 long years in which the earth broke open, and mountains flew like thrown stones, and 2 generations of gods fought to decide, once and for all, who would rule everything that ever came after. And you have not yet heard what came next, because when the last Titan finally fell, the earth herself was not finished. She had one more child still to give, a child born purely of grief and fury, built to be the end of everything the young gods had just won. Tonight we go back to the true beginning of power itself, to the war that made Zeus a king, and to the second war, almost lost, that nearly unmade him again before his throne had even grown cold. To understand how the world nearly tore itself apart, we must return, briefly, to where it truly started, not with Zeus, but with his father, and his father's father before him. In the very beginning, Gaia the earth and Uranus the sky brought forth the Titans, 12 children, vast and beautiful, and strong beyond ordinary measure, and among them the youngest and boldest was Cronus, who took a sickle from his own mother's hand and overthrew his father, and ruled after him. And Cronus, warned by a prophecy that one of his own children would someday overthrow him exactly as he had overthrown his own father, swallowed each of his children whole the moment they were born, sealing them alive in the dark of his own body, until his wife Rhea, unable to bear it any longer, hid away her 6th child on the island of Crete, and tricked her husband into swallowing a stone wrapped in swaddling cloth in his place. That child was Zeus. And when he came of age, hidden and safe on his mountain, he returned in secret and forced his father to disgorge every sibling he had swallowed: Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon. 5 gods now grown, now free, now standing shoulder to shoulder with the brother who had freed them, and ready, for the first time in the long history of that terrible family, to fight back. What followed was not a battle. It was not even really a war in any way a mortal army would recognize. It was closer to a slow and grinding catastrophe, a struggle so vast that the old poets, straining to find any language large enough to hold it, described the whole of creation groaning under its weight. On one side stood Cronus, and beside him nearly all of the mighty Titans. Arrayed upon the high peak of Mount Othrys, ancient, immovable, certain in the way that only beings who have never once been defeated can be certain. On the other stood young Zeus, newly freed, and his freed brothers and sisters beside him, gathered upon the answering peak of Mount Olympus, untested, outnumbered, and utterly without any weapon that could yet match the sheer accumulated age and power of the enemy arrayed against them. For 10 full years, the 2 sides hurled themselves against one another, and neither could break the other. Picture it, if you can bear to hold the scale of it in your mind for even a moment. Whole mountains torn up by their roots and flung across the sky like stones thrown by children. Rivers boiling in their beds and leaping their banks to find entirely new courses to the sea, courses some of them keep to this very day, though no mortal now living remembers why a river bends where it bends, the earth itself groaning under blows that would have shattered 100 ordinary worlds, and the deep sea itself, we are told, boiling from shore to shore, and the very air catching fire from the friction of powers that were never meant to collide so directly. Later ages, digging into the earth in places far from any battlefield mortals had ever fought upon, would sometimes unearth the vast bones of enormous and unnamed creatures, and shiver and bury them again, never once guessing that they had stumbled upon some fallen giant of that ancient and half-forgotten war. And for the whole of that decade, the deadlock did not break. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy, hearing the story told quickly, to imagine that the young gods simply overwhelmed the old ones through youth and daring. They did not. 10 years is a long time to hold a line against an enemy who does not tire and does not retreat, and for the whole of that decade, Zeus and his brothers and sisters gained nothing at all. No ground, no advantage, no sign that the balance was ever going to tip in their favor. Youth and daring, it turns out, are not enough to win a war against beings who have simply always existed and have never once needed daring in the first place. What the young gods needed was not more courage. They needed allies and weapons, and a piece of knowledge older even than the Titans standing against them. And all three of these things, it turned out, were waiting exactly where no one had thought to look, buried in the deepest and darkest pit in all of creation. For Uranus, the very first sky, had once looked upon 2 sets of his own children, and hated what he saw in them, and pushed them back down into the body of their own mother the moment each was born, sealing them away where the light could never reach them. There were the Cyclopes, giants with a single burning eye set in the center of the forehead, craftsmen whose hands could shape any metal as easily as a potter shapes wet clay. And there were the 100-handed ones, 3 brothers, monstrous beyond ordinary description, each one carrying 50 heads and 100 grasping arms upon a single body, strength piled upon strength, until the very idea of them defied easy imagining. Both had been buried in Tartarus, the deepest pit in the world. Since the very first days of creation, forgotten by nearly everyone, resented even by many of the Titans who had grown up alongside the memory of their imprisoned kin and had never once lifted a hand to free them. It was Zeus, advised, some of the old tellings say by his grandmother Gaia herself, who had never forgiven the ancient cruelty of burying her own children in the dark, and who now saw in her newest grandson a chance to finally set that old wrong right, who understood, in the middle of a war that showed no sign of ending, exactly where an unbeatable advantage might still be hiding, if only someone was willing to go down into the dark and fetch it. So Zeus descended, alone, into the pit of Tartarus, deeper than any god had gone since the world began, down through darkness that had held its prisoners since before Zeus himself had ever been born. And there he found the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones exactly where they had been left, generations of imprisonment weighing on them. And he did not come as a jailer checking on old prisoners. He came as a liberator, and he set them free. And gratitude, in these old stories, is very often the truest and most dangerous weapon of all. For the Cyclopes, freed at last, after an eternity of buried darkness, gave Zeus a gift that had never before existed anywhere in creation, the thunderbolt, lightning itself made solid, the raw, uncontainable fury of the storm forged into a weapon a god could actually hold in his hand and hurl at will. For Poseidon they forged a trident whose 3 points could split solid stone and shake the very foundations of the earth. For Hades they made a helm of shadow so complete that whoever wore it could move through the world entirely unseen, invisible even to the eyes of gods. And the 100-handed ones Three brothers, each wielding 100 arms at once, did not need any weapon forged for them at all. They simply strode to the front of the battle and began tearing whole mountains from the earth with their own countless hands, and hurling them 300 boulders at a time into the ranks of the ancient Titans arrayed against them. The long and grinding deadlock, 10 years unbroken, shattered in what the old poets describe as almost a single afternoon. Now, Zeus struck with the full and terrible weight of the heavens finally behind him. He hurled his new thunderbolts without ceasing until the whole visible world seemed to catch fire at once. The forests along Mount Othrys blazing, the great ocean itself boiling in its bed until the very fish and the creatures of the deep were driven mad by the heat. The solid ground running molten beneath feet that had stood firm through every other age of the world. The Titans, ancient and immovable as they had always been, discovered at last that immovable and invincible are not, in fact, the same thing, and one by one, scorched and battered and overwhelmed by an assault, the likes of which none of them had ever imagined possible, they broke and fell and were beaten down. When the fighting finally, mercifully ended, the young gods gathered up their defeated elders and cast them down into the very same pit of Tartarus, from which the Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones had so recently been freed. The deepest darkness in all creation, sealed now by bronze walls, 3 layers thick, with the newly liberated 100-handed ones themselves set as the eternal guards at the gate, so that the very beings once imprisoned there for the crime of being feared had become, in a final and fitting turn, the unbreakable wardens, keeping their former captors locked away forever. The age of the Titans, which had stood since before the making of the world, ended not gradually, but all at once, in fire, on a single unforgettable afternoon. Victory, though, is rarely as tidy as the stories that come after it make it sound, and this one raised a question every bit as dangerous as the war itself had been. 3 brothers had led the fighting to its end: Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades, and the whole of creation, newly won, now lay open before all 3 of them at once, with no law yet standing to decide how it should be divided. Rather than turn their newly forged weapons upon one another, which any lesser family might easily have done in the flush of victory, the 3 brothers chose instead to draw lots, casting their fates to simple chance rather than to further bloodshed. To Poseidon fell the sea, the whole wide and restless expanse of it, and he became its lord. To Hades fell the underworld, the shadowed realm beneath the living earth, where the dead would one day gather, and he took up that lonely and unglamorous throne without complaint, for a lot once drawn was a lot honored. And to Zeus fell the sky and the high air, and with it, by the simple accident of a favorable draw rather than by any particular claim of merit, a kind of ruling authority over the other 2 as well. The earth and high Olympus itself they agreed to hold in common, belonging to none of them alone. It was a strange and fateful bargain, decided as much by luck as by strength, and it is worth remembering. The next time, these 3 brothers seemed too grand and too inevitable to have ever been otherwise, that the whole shape of their kingdom was settled. In the end, by nothing more solemn than the drawing of lots among 3 tired brothers standing in the ashes of the war that had just made them kings. And so Zeus and his family climbed at last to the summit of Mount Olympus, its peak forever lost in cloud, and there they built their halls of gold, and there they sat their thrones, and there, for the first time since the beginning of the world, it seemed as though a lasting peace had finally settled over creation. But peace, in these old stories, is very rarely permanent, and it is very rarely as complete as it first appears. For Gaia, the earth herself, mother of the Titans and grandmother of the very gods who had just defeated them, watched her ancient children chained in the dark below her own body, and felt something that no thunderbolt and no victory feast on Olympus could ever quite reach or soothe. She had helped Zeus once, in the darkest hour of the war, guiding him down to the prisoners in Tartarus, when the young gods had no other hope of breaking the deadlock. But helping Zeus win a war against a father who had wronged her once, long ago, was never the same thing as forgiving him for what he did, in his turn, to her own Titan children once the war was over and won. And so, deep within her own body, in a hidden place, far from the sight of Olympus, Gaia began, quietly and patiently, to prepare one final and terrible answer to a victory she had never fully accepted. She went, the old tellings say, to Tartarus itself, to the very pit where her children now lay chained, and there she conceived, with the primordial pit as the father, a child unlike any that had yet walked or crawled or slithered across the face of the young and battered earth. His name was Typhon, and no description the old poets ever attempted quite manages to contain him. He was larger than any mountain, so vast that his head, the stories tell us, brushed against the very stars, and his outstretched arms could touch the rising sun with one hand and the setting sun with the other. From his shoulders sprang not 2 arms but 100 serpent heads, each one hissing and spitting black flame, each one speaking, when it spoke at all, in some different and unearthly voice, the roar of a bull, the shriek of a lion, the yelp of a hunting hound, the wordless scream of something with no proper voice at all, so that the whole vast and monstrous body of him seemed less like a single creature than like every terror the young world had ever known, gathered up together and given one enormous and unified shape. His lower body was not legs at all, but 2 colossal coils of viper, dragging behind him wherever he moved, crushing forests and splitting hillsides with the sheer moving weight of them. He was, in every sense, the old Greeks understood the phrase, the last and the greatest of all monsters. Gaia's final child, built with a single and unmistakable purpose. He was built to end the reign of Olympus before it had even properly begun. When Typhon rose at last from the depths and turned his full and terrible attention upon Olympus, even the gods themselves, who had just finished winning the greatest war the world had ever seen, felt something they had almost forgotten they were capable of feeling. They felt fear. The old poets describe a panic sweeping through the halls of heaven, unlike anything the Titanomachy itself had produced. For the Titans, terrible as they were, had at least been gods, ancient, powerful, and dangerous, but gods bound by the same fundamental rules that bound the young Olympians who fought them. Typhon was something else entirely, something closer to chaos itself, given shape and appetite, and several of the Olympians, by some of the stranger and more human of the old tellings, are said to have fled before him in genuine and undignified terror, some even transforming themselves into animal shapes and scattering across Egypt to hide from a monster that seemed, in that first terrible hour, entirely unstoppable. It is a detail the later poets loved precisely because it is so unexpectedly human. The same gods who had just conquered an entire generation of ancient Titans, running in raw animal panic from a single vast and howling child of the earth's own grief. Zeus alone did not run. He stood his ground on the high peak of Olympus, and as Typhon came roaring toward him, mountains splintering beneath those terrible coiling legs, Zeus met him with the same thunderbolts that had ended the Titans only recently before, hurling bolt after bolt of raw fire into that vast and serpent-headed body. And for a time, it seemed the outcome might be swift and certain, a second victory, following hard upon the first. But Typhon was not a Titan, bound by any of the old and familiar rules, and where lightning had broken armies before, it only enraged this final child of the earth further. And the battle that followed was unlike anything Olympus had yet witnessed. Typhon seized hold of Zeus in the tightening grip of his monstrous coils. And here the story takes its darkest and strangest turn of all. For, in that terrible embrace, Typhon did something no enemy in the whole history of the gods had ever managed. He cut the tendons from Zeus's hands and feet, the very sinews that gave the king of the gods the strength to lift a thunderbolt or take a single step. And he hid them away, wrapped in a bearskin, sealed inside a cave far from Olympus, and guarded by a dragon woman named Delphine. And he left Zeus himself, the supposed unassailable ruler of the whole of creation, broken and helpless upon the ground, unable to walk, unable to fight, unable even to reach for the weapon that had won him his throne only a short time before. Sit with this for a moment, because it is easy to let the story rush past it toward its eventual happy ending, and the old poets never meant for us to rush past it at all. The king of the gods, victor of the greatest war creation had yet seen, lay, maimed and helpless on the ground, his own body's strength stolen from him and hidden away by an enemy who had, for one terrifying stretch of the story, simply and completely won. There was no certainty in that moment that Zeus's reign would ever recover. Everything the young gods had fought 10 long years to build stood quite suddenly on the edge of being undone entirely by a single monstrous child, born purely of an old grandmother's grief and fury. It is one of the very few moments in the whole of Greek myth where the gods themselves are shown not merely challenged, but genuinely, completely defeated, if only for a while. And it is worth remembering the next time Zeus seems too permanent and too inevitable a king to have ever truly been threatened, that his whole reign once hung, quite literally, on whether anyone could steal back his own stolen sinews before it was too late. It fell in the end not to brute strength, which had already failed, but to cunning and to loyalty, to set things right again. Hermes, the swift and clever messenger god, together with the wild god Pan, crept in secret to the cave where Delphine guarded her stolen prize, and by trickery and daring stole back the hidden sinews from beneath the dragon woman's watchful eyes, and carried them, unnoticed, back to where Zeus still lay broken and waiting. And with his strength restored to him, sinew by sinew, Zeus rose again, and the true and final battle began. He took up his thunderbolts once more, and this time he did not simply hurl them and hope. He pursued Typhon across the whole width of the earth, driving the vast monster before him from land to land, scorching mountain after mountain as the two of them fought their way across half the known world, until at last, cornered and battered by blow after relentless blow, Typhon could run no further, and Zeus buried him in the final stroke of that long and terrible chase beneath the whole vast weight of Mount Etna itself, on the island of Sicily. And there the old tellings say he lies still, pinned beneath the mountain forever, and it is his fire, his endless and unquenchable rage, straining upward against the stone that holds him down, that the people of that island have felt for every century since, whenever the mountain shakes and smokes, and occasionally, in its own patient and monstrous way, still finds room to roar. And so at last, the true and final peace of Olympus began, not with the fall of the Titans, as the story is so often shortened to say, but only here, only after this second and far more nearly fatal war, when the very last and most terrible child the old earth had left to give was finally, permanently subdued. It is worth asking, before we close this long story, why the old Greeks needed two wars at all, when one alone would have made for a perfectly satisfying and complete tale. Why tell of the Titans, and then insist on telling of Typhon as well? The answer, I think, lies in what each war reveals about the nature of power itself, and about the peace that follows a victory too quickly assumed to be final. The war against the Titans was a war between two generations of the same essential kind of being, gods against gods, order against a different and older order, decided, in the end, by better weapons and cleverer allies. It is the kind of war that ends cleanly, with a throne changing hands and a new king settling comfortably into it. But the war against Typhon was something else entirely. It was the earth itself, wounded and grieving, refusing to simply accept the new arrangement quietly, refusing to let victory calcify into the illusion that all resistance had ended the moment the losing side was chained. Every throne, this second and darker war reminds us, is built upon ground that has its own long memory and its own capacity, however patient, to answer back. There is a quieter truth folded into this story too, easy to miss beneath all the thunder and the fire, and it belongs less to Zeus than to the beings who made his final victory possible. The Cyclopes and the 100-handed ones, remember, had been buried alive by Uranus for the crime of simply existing in a shape their own father found frightening. Left in the dark for longer than either war together would eventually last. It was not strength alone, and not thunderbolts alone, that finally settled the fate of the world. It was the freeing of the forgotten, the decision, made once by Zeus in the depths of his own desperate war, and once again, quietly, by Hermes and Pan in the depths of Zeus's own worst hour, to go looking for help in the one place the proud and the powerful had always assumed no help could possibly be found. Every great turning point in this entire long story belongs, if you look closely enough, not to the ones already strong, but to the ones who had been buried, or bound, or written off as monstrous, and who turned out, when finally given the chance, to be exactly what tipped the whole balance of creation. And so we return, at the end, to the question this long and thunderous story was quietly built to ask. What does it actually take to hold a throne, once it has been won? Not merely the strength to win the first war, the story insists, though that strength matters enormously. It takes the humility to know that a single victory, however total it feels, in the moment, rarely closes every account still owed. It takes allies found in unlikely and forgotten places, and the wisdom to free them, rather than leave them buried out of old suspicion or old fear. And it takes the willingness, even for a king who has just won everything, to be broken, however briefly and however completely, and to endure that breaking long enough for loyal hands, working quietly and without glory in some distant cave, to find a way to put the pieces back together again. Zeus's throne did not become permanent the moment the Titans fell. It became permanent only here on the smoking slopes of a Sicilian mountain, at the true and final end of two wars rather than one. And even then, the old poets remind us, gently, if you listen for it in the mountain's smoke on a quiet night, that some grief runs deep enough into the earth itself that it is never entirely extinguished, only with great effort and great help and a little bit of luck, finally held down. Rest now. Let the old mountain settle back into its long and patient quiet, its fire banked but never fully gone, and let the peace that was so hard won, across 2 wars and 2 generations of gods, settle gently over you as well, all the way down into sleep.